Hello and welcome back to Retro Ranger. Today I'm excited to talk about some of what I've been recently playing, which seem to be almost exclusive to the Sega Genesis. And from that I decided to dive a bit deeper into what other games that I've been enjoying over the years on this system. With the library being so diverse across so many different genres, it's no wonder why the system holds such good memories for many gamers, and I'm no exception there. The cool part I've always enjoyed is learning about games that I've not even heard of before on the Genesis, and so I thought it'd be fun to take a look at what I've been currently playing, as well as what I remember playing a ton of over the years. Here's a slice of what I've been getting up to on the Sega Genesis. Okay, first up is what brought me to the Genesis recently, Mega Man The Wily Wars. This is a compilation released in 1994 in Japan and Europe, but sadly never in North America, that is until recently. It features remakes of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3. Before we jump into the game itself though, I wanted to highlight the physical presentation from Retrobit as it's quite impressive. Here you can see the collector's edition which Retrobit published in 2021. It features this plastic protective sleeve around the box, but it features its own artwork that creates the overall art for the outside. The box has a flip cover with the art of Mega Man, Rush, and Wily's Robot Masters. Inside the flip cover is the holographic and lenticular cover that you saw on the front, but contains 4 other alternatives, each with the same treatment as the default Mega Man cover. And while I don't see myself swapping these out, I have to say it's a super cool idea. Inside the box is a double-sided Wily Wars poster, both of which look good, and a hard clamshell for the game itself. Inside the clamshell, though, is a great colored manual that covers everything that you'd expect. There's also a sticker book and a certificate of authenticity tucked in there as well. Of course, you have the game with the really well-made label on top of this nice translucent sparkle blue cartridge. Lastly, this edition came with 9 collectible cards featuring Mega Man, Proto Man, and some of the choice Robot Masters from the 3 games featured. They certainly didn't cut any corners on the physical side of publishing this title, which is impressive. Okay, on to the game now. As I mentioned, this is a compilation of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3. Only these games are remade with updated graphics and rearranged music tracks. Those graphic updates include changes to both sprites and stages, some of which gain new backgrounds than what was originally there. Art-wise, this is great to look at, and Capcom really did a nice job in updating the quality of these classics back in '94 while keeping true to the originals. The music arrangements are hit or miss. They're not bad, but after spending so many hours with the originals, even with the updated graphics, my brain just expects the classic music tracks. The games are, for the most part, really faithful to the originals. The stage layouts are all identical as far as I saw. This really is just a dressed up version of the game that you all know and love. One great divergence is that there's no password screens for the second and third game, replaced, thank God, with a save file. This works great and combats my biggest disappointment, which is the difficulty. There's no difficulty selection for any of the games, and it just seems to default to hard, since all the bosses take 1 billion pellet shots, so doing the masters in order is almost a must. What's worse is that there's noticeable lag input, which I spent a considerable amount of time trying to diagnose, but confirmed online with other reviewers that this is not insignificant. This is a near deal breaker for me, and it just sucked so much of the fun right out the window. One last minor gripe is on the controls. The originals coming from the NES used, of course, only 2 buttons in addition to the D-pad and start. You could argue the pause versus menu of Mega Man 1, but in general, the Genesis has a minimum of 3 buttons, so this should have been easy. While you can change the button configurations, you still have to assign the in-game menu to one of the action buttons instead of the start button. Too often I accidentally brought up the menu with my thumb catching the button, which is just silly. This should have never been mapped to anything else but the start button. Beyond all of that, this is Mega Man. I wish these issues were gone and that I'd have no real reason to ever play the originals on the NES, but sadly this won't replace them. Either way, it's cool to see the remade levels and bosses, and who knows, perhaps I'll buckle down and power through it one of these days. Let's jump back to a game from my past though for our next game. Oh, here's a game that just screams 90s, Comix Zone, spelled with an X of course. While Streets of Rage was my go-to for this style of game, the one I ended up picking off the shelf recently was this throwback to days of renting games at a Blockbuster or similar video store. As a kid who collected comics in the 90s, this game always caught my attention. You play as Sketch Turner, a comic book artist whose own villain from his latest work in progress manages to escape into the real world and put Sketch in his own comic, essentially reversing the roles. The first thing that you notice, of course, is that the game plays out in the comic panels, and it often incorporates many common comic book elements like textual segues, onomatopoeia word bubbles for hits, and more. Graphically, though, this game is great, and the art feels like an interactive comic book, so mission accomplished there. As you work your way from panel to panel, occasionally you'll get an option to choose the direction, which helps keep things fresh when restarting. And you'll often do that since the game fails to give you any real continues. A death in the first stage, for instance, is game over. The animations all look fantastic, and you can tell as you move through the stages and hop from panel to panel or hang from various things that they really took care here. Even monsters look great and are well animated. In many panels, Sketch will need to solve a puzzle, most of which are really simple, but to proceed and avoid getting hit in doing so. Despite their relative ease, it's still a great mix-up to the constant button mashing of a typical beat-em-up. Throughout the stages, you can collect items, up to 3 at any time, to use at the most appropriate instance. These items include health refills, your pet rat, who can actually help you solve challenges or aid in combat, dynamite for helping clear obstacles, or a fist that can turn you into a superhero for a moment and usually killing everything on screen. I did mention the difficulty, and that's really the biggest downside here. It doesn't take many hits to drain your life, but even some of the areas force you to punch obstacles that actually hurt you, if you don't have the dynamite, of course. The health refills certainly help, but they won't do anything if you're knocked down into a pit. It's just instant game over. If they just added infinite continues or maybe even a password function, this game would likely be at the top for many gamers. Overall, this is a fun and unique beat-em-up that I'm glad to have revisited. Sure, it's difficult, but most good games of this era were. Definitely one to check out if you happen to miss out on this one. Let's check out something that I just recently discovered for the Genesis for the first time. Next up is Haunting, starring Polterguy. How did I miss out on this amazing gem until now? Here's a game that definitely plays like a Genesis title of its time that just brings you right back to your childhood. This game is dripping, literally in some cases, of charm. You're Polterguy, a now-deceased teenager who is exacting his revenge on the Sardini family. There's some more story there to explain why, but it doesn't really matter. You're a ghost and you get to scare folks until they're frightened enough to leave their house altogether. You do this by enchanting various objects throughout the house. To do that, Polterguy must approach a potential object and see a color indicator, which is called a frightum. The color describes what kind of frightem it is. A blue is an automatic trigger, just dive in and out and the scare will go off without a hitch, assuming you have a family member in the room to scare, that is. The orange is a manual trigger, and once you dive in, you wait until you want the fright to go off and you manually trigger it. I think there's a timing element here that you want the family member to be close to you and not already being scared by another fright, but perhaps I'm making it more complicated on myself. The last frightem is green, which lets Polterguy possess the object in question, and you control its movement as you chase them around the room with it. There's a limited time window for this, and if you press the action button before the time runs out, there's usually a finale to the possession. It's really impressive how many items there are to interact with throughout the game. Each house has many rooms, and each room contains a bunch of frightems, all with their own unique animations that encourage the player to explore and see what the game really has to offer. Using these frightems, your goal is to raise the fear level of the family member in the room so that they run out scared. When they do, they drop ectoblobs, which refill your ecto time meter on the bottom of the screen. If you're in a room that's connected to an exterior door, there's a possibility that when they run out scared, they run out of the house completely. Once you get everyone out of the house, the family, unable to will themselves back into the house, moves, and of course, you follow them to do it again. There's 4 houses in total, and with each one, there's an increase in difficulty. If you run out of time on your ecto time meter, you get pulled down into the underworld. This is a dungeon, as the manual calls it, and it's your chance to save yourself and go back to scaring the Sardini family. To do so, though, you're going to need to go around the dungeon collecting ecto blobs that refill your portion of the meter. Doing so quickly will help, though, as the blobs shrink in size fast and thus yield less refill. Like you'd expect in any underworld, there's plenty of dangers lurking around, and if you take enough damage, it's game over. Interestingly, though, your health doesn't actually refill after you escape the underworld, so the next time that you're pulled in, you'll resume with your existing health. The last thing I'll mention is that you have some powers that you can pick up from the underworld to use in the house. These spells will aid Polterguy by refilling the ecto time meter, give him scares beyond the frightems, and things to distract dangers in the house like the dog, for example. Some of these are not super intuitive on how to use them, though. The super scare is the prime example where you need to use it in a room, then you're supposed to leave the room, and finally in the game menu press A, B, and then C in order for it to work. And while the menu tells you this, it could have been much more intuitive or better explained, especially when you consider they had an in-game tutorial in the beginning, which is actually a little ahead of its time. Thankfully, that's the only gripe I could come up with. This is a solid Genesis title and one that I'll be definitely returning back to in the future. Put this one on your radar for sure. Let's move on to our next game. Here's one that I've been playing for years. This one is called Devilish. It's a brick breaker game with a bit of a twist. A demon transforms a prince and princess into pong paddles, and they work together to keep the ball alive, which is their hope in defeating the demons and restore themselves once again. The story isn't what matters here, and it's really all in the gameplay. Unlike most brick breakers, the screens are not static, and they scroll like you'd see in an action game, which is key because this feels akin to an action game, even though it's your typical ball and paddle setup. Your front paddle is the offensive one, and that can move both vertically and horizontal, in addition to flipping either left or right to help you kind of traverse the winding stages. The back paddle is the defensive one and can only move horizontally and cannot flip. If you're playing a 2-player game, one player controls each, and the roles of the offensive and defensive players are switched between each level. My son and I had a blast playing this, and it's a big improvement over the 1-player mode, where the defensive paddle would just simply match the horizontal location of the offensive paddle. As you make your way through the stages, there'll be various ways to interact with your surroundings. There's bricks that deactivate the offensive paddle for a short time period, forcing the defensive player to, well, defend. There's also power-ups like this cool fireball that makes quick work of the stage. Tunnels which circumvent dangers or even cannons which can fire you across big chunks of the stage all keep these levels feeling exciting. At the end of each stage, you'll fight a boss, and these are definitely the highlight of the game. Each boss is unique and throws new challenges at you as they ramp up in difficulty as the game goes on. As typical with this style of game, it's sometimes more luck than skill on how you move the ball, though if you're able to position the ball near the hitboxes of the bosses, you can sometimes inflict a ton of damage quickly as they don't have much, if any, invulnerability time between hits. I get that this may not be for everyone, but I do find myself coming back to this again and again, for the sword and sorcery meets Arkanoid. The combination works well for me and it's always a good time. This is technically the second game in this series, with the first being on the Game Gear and the third being on the Nintendo DS. I've not yet played the DS version, but the Game Gear one is just as fun, so play it wherever it makes the most sense for you. Let's move on to a new one that I just started playing. This is Quackshot, starring Donald Duck. This was recommended to me by a friend somewhat recently and just finally getting around to it. As you suspect, you play as Donald Duck as you traverse various action platformer stages through some pretty unique locations. Those locations continue to expand as the game goes on, and you can select any stage at any time, provided it's on your map. The order in which you complete stages isn't quite as open as it seems though, as there's usually some spot that's blocked by an ability or an item that's needed to progress. Your only option is to take the airplane to a different location in search of what you need and ultimately backtrack when you get it from another stage. Dare I say this is a Metroidvania? Despite the backtracking, this feels more of a lighthearted action platformer than anything else. Control of Donald feels good, if a slight bit slippery, though I would highly encourage you to change the control setup as it defaults to having dash not adjacent to the jump button for some reason. Once you get the controls squared away, it's off to hunt some treasure in your Indiana Jones costume. Donald is armed with his Quackshot gun, and it has 3 types of ammunition: plungers, popcorn seeds, and bubbles, each of which have their own use cases. When you start out, the plungers just incapacitate enemies for a short while, allowing you to move past the danger. Later, you'll upgrade the plunger to act as a platform, which lets you get to new areas of existing levels. The other items, like the bubbles, will break bricks. Apparently these are the heavy-duty kind of bubbles, but are limited in ammo. Thankfully, the plunger, even upgraded, has infinite ammo. Use of each will be required to traverse the later stages, so it's helpful that you can pick up some ammo from enemies and other destructibles along the way. The art for Quackshot is great, and the animations are pretty impressive for the system. The stages are mostly fun and mix up platforming with clever enemy and danger placement that keeps the levels fresh throughout. The only exception to this is the stage with the magic door trope that has you weaving in and out of doors until you just happen upon the right sequence, but beyond that, the rest are great. Overall, I had low expectations for this coming in, but I was surprised at the depth of gameplay for a Donald Duck game. There's puzzles, fun combat, platforming, and boss fights spread across roughly 8 unique levels. Combine that with the strong art and decent music, this is a title that I'm glad to have found, and I'm looking forward to spending some more time with it as time goes on. Let's move on to one of my favorites for the system. Okay, here's Shinning Force 2, out of the expansive Shining series, of which I thoroughly enjoy. Well, the strategy RPGs anyways. While my love for this game is driven a lot by nostalgia, this really does hold up well today. This is a strategy, or tactical if you prefer, RPG that uses grid-based movement and a set turn order to complete combat. In between combat, you explore towns and other areas to progress your typical RPG story elements. Others in this series streamline that process from battle to battle, but in this entry, players are free to explore, upgrade weapons, or buy items and talk with NPCs outside of a guided experience. During battles, you control the Shinning Force, a band of heroes of different classes fighting for the greater good. As the game continues, so does the size of the Force, and it begins to provide you with some ways in which you can build out your cohort for battles. When those encounters occur, in turn order, you select where to move the individual and what action they take, such as attacking, casting a spell, or using an item. Things like range for attacks are all indicated, so like most of these type of games, movement remains critically important. Once you choose to attack, the sequence is carried out in a mini battle scene. Following that, the attacker is awarded experience points and potentially other things like gold or items dropped from a fallen victim. Like most RPGs, XP will award increased combat levels after certain thresholds are hit, which directly impact combat stats, and each class has their own primary attributes that help them in their role for the Shining Force. Once a Force member reaches level 20, they're eligible to be promoted to an advanced class, which resets their combat level back to 1, but overall grants them stronger statistics and combat options. The story isn't incredibly deep with this game. Your kingdom befalls hardship after an ancient tower is unknowingly unlocked, letting demons escape who begin to possess not only your king but others as well, which brings about war. It's up to the Shining Force to restore order and seal away the menacing demon. While it's not going to win an Oscar, it's thankfully not overly generic either, which was pretty common too. It's compelling enough to keep you guessing on what's going to happen next, which seems to validate its mark as a good RPG. Overall, I consider this a must-have for the system for any RPG fan, as there's plenty of hours of great entertainment to be had with this one. Let's move on to another second in its own series. Okay, last up today is Splatterhouse 2. There's something to be said for the Genesis and its second installments of series. Streets of Rage 2, Sonic 2, Shining Force 2, Devilish was technically the second game in its series, Phantasy Star 2. Clearly they had something figured out for the second in the installments. Anyways, like I said, this is Splatterhouse 2, and if you're unfamiliar with the series, here is the 30-second catch-up. You play as Rick, who escaped into a mansion with his girlfriend Jennifer to escape a storm, only the house wasn't the friendly kind and Rick is killed and Jennifer is taken away. Rick is resurrected by this mask, which totally don't think for a moment this is Jason's mask from Friday the 13th, and it gives him some serious 2 to take on the horrors that exist and ultimately save Jennifer, only he doesn't and she dies. That's the story from the first game, and here it's been some time since the events of the first, but the mask is back and tells Rick that Jennifer isn't beyond saving somehow, so it's time to suit up and take care of business Rick style. The game plays as a pure 2D side-scroller in a linear fashion through stages that are divided into sections. These sections are important as they also act as checkpoints if you die and have extra lives remaining. You can pick up weapons like a shotgun, for instance, which helps, though they do have limited use or bullets depending on the item, and are dropped if you're hit while carrying them. Beyond the weapons, Rick can kick, punch, or kick slide his way to save Jennifer. This game is tough, and it reminds me a bit of Dragon's Lair in that you really need to work up some muscle memory, where each area you come to is almost a predetermined set of moves that you need to execute on to get through unscathed. When you do finally make it past that section that you've been struggling on, it really feels rewarding as the music and tone continues to push you ever onward. The graphics for the stages are somewhat of a letdown. The Genesis was definitely capable of better than what you're seeing, and especially in these dark areas where I think they just got a bit lazy. That said, what they left out on the stages, they included on the bosses, as like the first game, the grotesque bosses really return here in full form, and it's great to see it from start to finish. New in this installment is a password system, which is really nice. You have infinite continues, so you can just keep going during a single session, but being able to come back to it later and continue where you left off is very much welcomed. Another welcome change is some mix-up to the boss fights, my favorite being this mini-boss on the last stage after rescuing Jennifer. You need to knock down these spikes out of the air and throw them back at the creature with just the right height to land a blow, all while dodging more spikes. It's suspenseful and it's fun just to break away from what the normal kicking and punching at baddies or possessed items. While I usually default to the original on the TurboGrafx 16 if I'm going to break out Splatterhouse, this was a great time and it served as a good reminder that this series continues to be good on the Genesis. If you're in the mood for some retro horror, look no further than Splatterhouse because this game still holds up well. And there you have it. 7 great titles for the Genesis that have been an absolute blast to either revisit from my past or discover for the first time. As I stuck some serious play into the system, it was surprising to see how much diversity there is across the entire game library. I'm happy with our slice into what that mix was, but as always, I'm curious to know what you all think. What games have you been discovering or coming back to on the Genesis lately? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, thank you for watching Retro Ranger.